Thank you, Senator Boving.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your thoughts and your knowledge on all of this. We've talked about conventions. I want to move to treaties. And as you know, our NAFTA is under negotiation now, and we have a number of trade treaties with a number of countries. So my question is, will do you anticipate any of Canada's international trade treaties being affected by this? And are any of our treaty agreements linked to Canada's participation in the UN drug convention control treaties?
Thank you, Senator. I can assure you that no legalization of cannabis will not violate any of Canada's obligations under the NAFTA, under the World Trade Organization, or under the CETA, the European Trade Agreement. As with the implementation of any measures implicating international trade, consideration needs to be given to ensuring consistency with Canada's existing international obligations. So we've done that consideration before we proceed. And with regard to NAFTA, I can tell you that the legalization of cannabis has not been raised in the context of the NAFTA negotiations.
So is it fair to conjecture then that Canada's trade and import or export of medicines will not be impacted by any of this, or do you think treaties regulating international controls and trade missions will be affected, or trade in medicines will be affected? So I guess I'm now moving from the broad to the medical side.
Okay, well, thank you. There will be no changes to the import and export of cannabis as a result of the new legislation. As is currently the case, the import and export of medical cannabis will continue to be permitted under very limited circumstances, subject to the authorization of Health Canada and consistent with our obligations under these international drug conventions. The unauthorized import or export of cannabis will remain a serious criminal offense.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Green.
Yes, thank you very much. Most of the questions that I've had have already been asked, but is the Canadian Embassy in Washington and its consulates around the U.S. involved in any outreach or communications plan with regard to cannabis in Canada with their American audiences?
I think there's two. He's talking about the public, but there's also the intergovernmental conversations which are happening at different levels. So interesting.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, the Canadian Embassy is involved in discussions with the administration. They are to this stage here. There have been really very minimal discussions with members of Congress. In fact, we recently just did an inventory of the number of times this issue has come up in discussions with congressional members, and it's come up twice over the last 12 months. And one raised by a congressman who was very much pro-legalization, and one was raised by a congressman who had wanted to know how the legalization squared with our broader strategy for opioids. But in terms of our broader consulate network within the U.S., we are preparing a communication strategy to ensure that not only the members of the administration, but also people at the state level, at the local level within the United States are aware of the legislation. Importantly, are aware of the continued prohibition of the transfer of or the cross-border movement of cannabis.
In the meetings that you've been having with Americans and the outreach done by consulates, et cetera, what are the 2 or 3 main issues or flags that pop up in your discussions with Americans? What are they concerned about?
Let me add, from my perspective, and the kinds of discussions and contacts that take place between Americans and Canadian officials are varied, and there's a great many of them. I have a direct contact on a regular basis with my counterpart in the Department of State, and my colleagues in other government departments in Canada have their own dialogue. The main conversation issue that I have with my counterpart is urging them to give us clarity in terms of the posture of the CBP agents, how they will interact with Canadians crossing the border. The more clarity we can get in terms of the kinds of questions that Canadians will be asked, the kinds of expectations of Canadians when they want entry into the United States, that kind of clarity will help us as a government develop the education programs, education campaigns that will be conducted on an ongoing basis so that Canadians are educated about what the risks are and what the requirements are and what they should know if they want to have an untroubled entry and exit from the United States.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Musakos.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. My first question is, has Foreign Affairs been asked by this current government to do an analysis or bring back information to this government on partners and other nations in the world that have a different model of approach to dealing with marijuana use? For example, i.e., we keep Norway, which has statistically been proven to have the lowest usage of marijuana amongst young people. Has Foreign Affairs done any analysis or study or reported back to the government on different models outside of the current one that's being proposed?
I'm confident that we have done a considerable amount of research in that regard. There are many, many different models, as I alluded to earlier, around the world of governments that have taken different approaches. And the UNGAS, the UN General Assembly Special Session, has repeatedly reaffirmed that there needs to be a differentiated approach and that governments need to adapt their policies and their postures according to their own national circumstances. And so in developing the Canadian legislation, we have looked at what others have done, and we've tried to look at what best approach would apply to the Canadian reality, and that is why the legislation takes the shape it does today.
So Foreign Affairs has proposed to the commission that studied the legalization of marijuana for the government, they've proposed to them an analysis done by Foreign Affairs by other models around the world? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not specifically familiar with the approach taken, but I do know that my colleagues in the Department of Health and Justice, in developing the legislation, benefited from a wide array of information and research, including benchmark studies of what other countries have done.
So you're saying Foreign Affairs has done that analysis and has that information?
Foreign Affairs has contributed a great amount of analysis and information to the drafters of the legislation, yes, and that includes what other country models are and how they have operated and the lessons learned.
Would that information be readily available to be shared with this committee?
I'd be very happy to make available to you information of that kind.
I would appreciate that. My second question has to do with the claim that we've heard continuously from the government and has been reiterated here today by yourselves that Canada has the highest usage of marijuana amongst young people. Is it possible for you to also provide what source and the methodology used? Because clearly Foreign Affairs shares that view. It's a statistics that has been quoted by ministers before the Senate of the whole, and the government continues to make that claim based on a UNICEF report, from what I understand, of 2013, which UNICEF had claimed was a report from Justice Canada and was subsidized by Statistics Canada, but there seems to be some ambiguity of that study. So, and again, I see Foreign Affairs officials using that same figure. So I was just wondering if Foreign Affairs can provide this committee the source and methodology of the analysis that leads your department to reiterate the claim that we have the highest usage amongst young Canadians of marijuana use around the world?
Senator, thank you for that question. I'm not in a position to give you that kind of answer. As an employee of the Department of Global Affairs, my mandate is international. And so the information that we use that you're requesting is of a domestic nature, and it would be our domestic partner agencies and departments who would be responsible for developing that, those statistics and that set of information. That could be made available to you so that you could review it and assure yourself of the validity of that information.
So can we source that out through the appropriate departments, Chair? Because
Well, I
again, it's a
think
claim
that's
made
the
before.
point. We've heard it's UNICEF, but it was Canadian-based. And so would that be Justice? Would that be StatsCan that we should go to find out more about the report? Because all we get is the conclusion.
Yeah.
And trying to track down.
And the officials shared that stat again today, so I figure it got substantiated by the department.
No, it's very helpful in other work we've done with StatsCan is to find out what was their objective, how did they, and the results. Because if you just get the results, you're not quite sure what it's based on.
Right.
And therefore, there's a question mark over it. And if we can get the details with StatsCan, we did it in trade. It was very helpful to know what they were getting and the results. We could then actually use it very helpfully.
Yeah.
So
I
If you can
believe
tell us who
the
we
source
have
of
to
that
go to.
information would be our colleagues in Health Canada
Health
and
Canada.
Stats Canada. Some combination of the two are probably responsible for producing that kind of information.
Do I have time for one more question, Chair?
please.
My last question has to do, of course, with the Canada-U.S. Border Services. And, of course, as you know, successive governments right now have been working very hard on the strategy of thinning out that border and making it as accessible as possible for both, the exchange of people, trade, and commerce. And of course, we've taken steps to add more pre-clearance available to Canadian citizens on the Canadian side and on the American side, vice versa. Will you agree with my premise that it makes it a lot easier to continue to cooperate in thinning out that border if there's compatibility between both sides of the border on issues as important as this one, for example, when it comes to drug trafficking, when it comes to drug use? The Americans have a very rigid it's a criminal code vis-a-vis the marijuana legislation, and now we're going to the other extreme on the other side. So it's nice to be told that and reassuring this committee that there shouldn't be any incompatibility in terms of what we've experienced over the last few years with our cooperation on the border. But some of us on this side are a little bit skeptical. And what impact ultimately will have on the Nexus program? Because as you fully know, Nexus is such a close cooperative operation between Canada Border Services and U.S. Canada Border Services to the point where we share offices between our customs officers and U.S. officers. So you'll have two countries, two customs officers that are trying to become as emulsified as possible the last few years in order to thin out the border. And on this critical issue, they're going to have two diametrically opposed operative manuals. How do we overcome that compatibility? And I'm concerned, what impact will that have on our current Nexus program?
Most trusted traveler. Good question. Good question.
Thank you for the question, Senator. There invariably will be differences between our customs and our entry requirements between Canada and the United States, and I would use firearms as one example. There are differences between Canada and the U.S. In terms of the possession or the entry into another country with firearms. But we've been able to work together collaboratively our border agencies have been able to work together collaboratively to deal with those issues of misalignment. But I would say one thing: we are very much aligned on the central principle that both the import and the export of cannabis across the Canada-U.S. border will remain prohibited. So we will be working, our customs, our CBSA and CBP will be working very closely to ensure that that prohibition is respected. So we're very much aligned on that central tenet. And we will be, one of the questions another senator asked previously was what are some of the concerns that the Americans have raised? Well, one of the concerns is what are we going to do proactively to ensure that Canadians do not try to enter the United States in possession of cannabis? So we will have a public education campaign to ensure that Canadians and Americans continue to be aware that even though there is legalization in Canada, that the movement of cannabis across the border will continue to be prohibited. So in that sense, the two customs agencies are very much are on the same. They have the same manual.
And you didn't answer the question in regards to my biggest concern, which is Nexus. Right now, we have tons of people on both sides of the border that benefit from the use of the Nexus program, which gives us almost uninhibited access and quick access to the U.S. side as Canadians and vice versa. And that is probably the most homogeneous program right now between the two border services. And what impact will it have where we have an incompatibility on such a critical issue? What impact might that have on the Nexus program when the Americans finally wake up and realize that, oops, Canada's actually done this, and now we have to deal with it? Will it have an impact on the current Nexus program?
Unfettered right to an access card if they break U.S. penalty.
Yeah, so Senator, so it's CBSA that administers the Nexus program here in Canada, and they indicate that for the purposes of continued membership in the Nexus or the FAST program, loss of the membership privileges will be determined if the applicant is in violation of the program requirements. So the CBSA will advise its CBP partner that when that membership is either denied or revoked. So each of the individual customs agencies is responsible for the administration. Under the current Nexus program, Canada and the U.S. are each responsible for determining their own eligibility. The reasons for the rejections are not shared between the two countries because of privacy laws. Nexus card cancellations and rejections initiated by CBP officers can be appealed through the U.S. redress process, and there's a similar redress process here in Canada. I think we have to take into consideration that the Nexus program is one of the most the highest secure secure traveler program that we have with the United States, and it's intended to make travel facilitation easier for those Canadians that pass that high level. So there is no right to a Nexus program. There is no right to participate in the FAST program. At this point in time, we will continue to obviously monitor very closely any impact on the Nexus or the FAST programs, and we'll be working very closely with CBP to analyze and monitor the trends over time.
Okay, thank you. Senator Coles.
Thank you very, very much, Chairman. I would like to thank the witnesses for coming before us, but I must tell them that I'm not persuaded by what I'm hearing. And I would like to say that this particular change in public policy is bothering me a great deal. And for the largest reasons, I do not see the necessity of it. But having said all of that, I would like to remind colleagues here that we're talking about a psychoactive narcotic. So we're not legalizing the use of chocolate or something that's very commonplace and of no danger. And maybe I'm using the word psychoactive, and people may not know what I mean here, but a psychoactive drug is one that starts to go after the chemistry of the brain and rearranges reality for people. You remember back in the 60s, there were lots of deaths from LSD, and that was a psychotropic drug, but at the same time it was psychoactive. And I think we should bear this in mind. We're not talking about a simple little thing here. We're talking about a narcotic. And I don't see how this substantive change in Canadian public policy is not going to affect our relationship with the United States of America. Some years ago, a group of us, members, well, I was the only senator, but the others were members of the House of Commons, somehow or the other had been approached for a very exclusive meeting with an individual from the United States of America who was very high in the business of regulating drugs. And he informed us in no uncertain terms that if Canada went down the road of legalizing marijuana, the United States would do everything it had to do to protect their young people from marijuana. Strong words for a person who was a guest to us, but it sort of was seared into my psyche. I don't know if you want to comment on all of this, but I do not see how a profound change of the nature that is anticipated here and intended cannot have a result between our relations, in our relationship. Now, maybe you're extremely skilled in the business of fraternity. That may very well be, and I know that diplomacy is something I respect highly, but it is going to change every time a person now crosses the U.S. border and they produce their Canadian identification. It is going to have a different reaction than it did before. Nothing can change and remain the same. Thank you. Go ahead.
Do you want to respond
He's
to
very
that?
friendly. Thank you.
Or do you want to pass that on to the minister?
I'd be very happy to pass that on to the minister, Senator. I didn't hear a question there, but I heard a very strongly worded comment, and I'm very happy to pass that along.
Please do, please do. And it's a large question that we have before us. And I'm struggling as to whether or not I can vote for this legislation myself. I don't mind sharing that with colleagues.
I'll turn to Senator No.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think all the question has been asked, but I'm going to raise a few questions and answers which I don't hear the proper answer from Mr. Thompson or Mr. Gordowski. According to the testimony from a lawyer in the United States in front of the National Defense and Security, he said that the Canadian had ever used marijuana can immediately lead to a life ban from entering the United States. And he said that the United States will continue to deny entry to Canadians who admit to having smoked marijuana or having marijuana in possessions, even if cannabis become legal in Canada. Now, you say that during the border crossing last year, 13 million, only 6,000 has been asked. If the C-45 become legal, the children between the age of 12 to 17 can have 4 grams legally in possessions, and the adult above 18 can have more. Do you think that a family across the border with the car, the parents and the kids, 12 and 15, 17 years, and the adolescents, and you think that become legal that the United States won't ask questions? And those family will deny entry for life ban because the kid's 12 years old or 13 years old, he can have the 4 gram in his pocket without knowing it. Well, he can be charged. What do you think on that?
So it's a very serious point that you're making, Senator. I can start by saying that every Canadian, whenever they travel, should be aware of the national laws of the country that they are seeking entry to. So we need to continue and enhance a national campaign of educating Canadians of what is expected of them and what are the requirements and what are the risks if they choose to enter the United States carrying a prohibited substance according to U.S. federal law. What I can tell you is that we've got no indication from the United States, as my colleague has mentioned, that they intend to change their posture in terms of how they interact with Canadians at the border. To date, they are not banning Canadians. They're not asking the question, have you ever consumed cannabis or marijuana in your life? But they do have the right to, and I suspect they will continue this practice, which is if they see obvious signs in a vehicle or on the person of somebody that there is drug paraphernalia or there's a smell emanating from an automobile, they have the right to pursue a line of questioning of that individual. And that probably is a practice that will continue. And Canadians will need to be aware that if they should be taking precautions when they attempt to cross a border, that they should not carry cannabis, they should not have obvious signs of cannabis consumption on their person, because they can be questioned, and that right will be a right that the U.S. Border Protection Agency will continue to have, just as our border officers have the right to question individuals where there are uncertainties that crop up in the course of their entry into Canada.
Can I follow up? I'm still not very happy with that because once become legal, naturally everybody across the border to the United States under the age of from 12 to 17 and above 18, the United States will automatically think that, okay, that kid or whatever there, he might have 4 grams. They can search. And then the kids, well, you know, the children 13, 14, they have no intention to have it. But if they have something like, you know, the dust of cannabis in their pocket or whatever there, he can be charged. He or she can be charged at 13, 14 years old.
Senator, I should remind you, our legislation will strictly control cannabis consumption and keep it out of the hands of children. So it would be illegal in Canada for a 14-year-old to be in possession of cannabis, let alone trying to transport that across an international border. So the scenario that you're indicating...
Are you sure? Because in the bill, C-45, the kids between 12 and 17 are allowed to have 4 grams in possessions.
No, the legislation...
Whether they smoke or not, I don't know, but
legislation...
they're allowed to have 4 grams.
Senator, Canadian citizens, residents under the age of 18 are will not be allowed to possess or consume cannabis under the new legislation. I think what you're referring to is they may not be subject to prosecution if they are found to have an amount of 4 grams or less. But the intent of the legislation is to the extent possible, keep cannabis out of the hands of our youth, to address the problem that we currently have, which is this very, very high rate of youth consumption of cannabis.
Well, okay.
I think maybe you should review the legislation as it's being presented, and you may wish to add to your testimony on some of these sections of the C-45. Because there is a capability of children having it. And so that is different from what we are today. There's also capability of sharing it in a way that hasn't been before. So I think we're getting into very specific, and so you may wish to review and add to. Otherwise, we'll just take your testimony as it is, okay?
If I may, Senator, the best source of detailed answers for your questions would be the departments that are the sponsors of this legislation, Health and Health Canada. And so I don't sit here as purporting to be an authority on the legislation clause by clause. That's my understanding. But if you want a detailed answer, it would be our colleagues at Health Canada that could give you that.
I think my researchers are giving me Clause 8.1c of C-45. You're responding to it, so I think there's a responsibility that you may wish to come back in relation to the question that Senator Noah has put to you.
Senator, if there was any inaccuracy in my answer, I will most certainly correct that. I'm here as a representative of Global Affairs. I'm more
That's why I'm
mandated
giving you
to
a
speak
little
to the
bit of
international
stretch.
dimensions, and these domestic ones are not necessarily within my expertise.
Okay?
Please. This one come to international now. We have some countries like Malaysia or some country in Asia. If even you possess cannabis, you can be charged of the death penalty. Do Global Affairs has any particular, you say that you are preparing to do education and so on and so on. So those travelers to other countries without knowing the custom, the traditions, their law, be charged, on those criminal code of their own country, because if you possess cannabis or drugs, something like that, you can be charged. But death penalty, like Malaysia, right? And my second question is also, what do you anticipate how legalizing marijuana impact our international students coming to Canada?
Senator, Global Affairs maintains what we call a travel advisory function, which is for every country in the world. We publish, and it is online available for every Canadian, and we encourage every Canadian to consult our travel advice before they travel to a country, because it will include, and it today includes information about risks that might be experienced by Canadians when traveling abroad. And it includes everything from criminality to penalties that you refer to. And so that advice is very important for Canadians to follow. And it exists today, a real risk that Canadians traveling with certain narcotics are subject to. And that risk will obviously exist in the future, even under our new legislation. But the function of Global Affairs is to provide advice to Canadians when traveling to help them avoid these situations of risk.
My second question is regarding the international students.
I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that. An international student living in Canada would be subject to Canadian law. And as long as they abide by Canadian law, there should be no issue. And so perhaps you want to more specify.
The question I'm asking is the legalizing marijuana will impact those students, because from their own country, they're not allowed to smoke, right? Now, if they come here with 12, 21 years old students in university, British Columbia, they're allowed to go to the smoke pot and then buy some 1 gram, 2 gram, they can smoke.
Senator, the legislation doesn't compel adults, Canadians, or visitors to Canada or students to consume cannabis. It makes it possible and permissible and legal to do so. So the same freedom that a Canadian adult would have to consume or not to consume would apply to an international student.
I think the question is not a legal one. It's a question of students come here and they develop a way of life, which may include some addiction to the use, and they go home. Are they in more jeopardy? And what are we going to do to forewarn them? You know, it's the same issue. Global Affairs has been struggling with this for years. We have Canadians, especially young people, who go somewhere else and they still think that they can do what they can do in Canada. And so that's why we've had a lot of education to say if you go to a country where they have an absolute prohibition, you may pay with your life. But we had a lot of education. So what I find a bit contradictory, with what you're saying, on the one hand, you told me under the international conventions that this is the low scale. I mean, there are all these other narcotics and drugs of all kinds on our international conventions, and this is the least, you know, in your opinion. Yet, if Canadians go with the idea that it's okay, and young people really don't read the fine print, you know, of all the good information that you give, if we keep saying that it's on the low end, they're going to think it's a trifling thing when they go to other countries, and they're going to find out it's not trifling. So I guess my question to follow up is, what education are you proposing? Have you started any sort of campaign that you'll be ready to, are either doing it now or will once the legislation comes in, on educating the public again that marijuana may be easily dispensed around here, but don't try it elsewhere? Do you have a program, I guess is what I'm asking.
Senator, thank you for the question. I'm not aware of actions that were taken in that regard. I'd be very happy to consult with my colleagues and provide that information. As you know, education is a provincial responsibility. So in terms of our international education practices, we work with the provinces to recruit international students. And you're quite right. One of the things that we will wish to ensure is that international students and their families and their parents are aware of the circumstances that they could be putting their children into as a result of this new legislation. So the education will need to be a two-way street. Canadians will need to know how to behave when they seek to travel abroad. And likewise, foreigners, especially foreign students, will need to know the kind of laws that exist in our country. I would say that this would not be a first time that foreigners have to adapt to a different set of local laws. In the case of drinking, for example, alcohol is prohibited in many countries. In Canada, it is not. And so foreign students from those countries where alcohol is prohibited are in a situation currently of having to adapt to that, and their parents are having to make decisions based on those kinds of considerations.
There is a responsibility, though, federally around passports and travel. And when Canadians run into difficulties, consular services need to be provided. So it isn't just a provincial responsibility. And so my question is there any contemplation of giving education tools to Canadians who travel, which we've done over the years, adapting to it? So are you doing anything to adapt to C-45? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Forgive me, Senator, I thought you were referring to international students.
No, I like the answer anyway.
It
covers another area, but mine is on that.
Yes, in terms of Canadians traveling abroad, we will very much adapt our travel advice and our other communication products for Canadians so that they know the risks that they face when they travel abroad and they can adapt accordingly.
Is there any development, or are you going to do it once the law passes?
I would need to consult with colleagues to give you the accurate information in
I'd
terms of the
appreciate
specific
receiving that in
products that we
writing.
have in mind, yes.
Thank you. Senator Bovey, you want to comment on this part or something?
Oh, may I add a comment?
Absolutely.
As one who's been involved with international students coming into the country and our students going out of the country, I think many international students coming to Canada, it's not just the potential new addition of marijuana, it is alcohol that's new for many. Eating habits are new situations that students have to adjust to. Co-ed residences is another I've dealt with foreign students. So I think this is another thing to add to education that's already out there for students wanting to come to Canada, especially from specific parts of the world. And with our students going overseas, I can tell you when they apply overseas, if they've got the mentorship I would hope have at the universities they're studying here, that's part of what we work with them before they go. So I wonder, Madam Chair, if it would be an interesting idea to have somebody from Universities Canada, for instance, to come here and talk about the kinds of provisions that with Bill C-45 they would be making for our students going overseas and international students coming to our universities, because I know application rates are increasing for international students.
That's why my question is that every time we make a change, we have to make sure that we're educating.
Of Universities Canada or whatever. I mean, I think there are a number of people who could come.
We're
and
under a
respond to that.
time crunch, but we'll see what can happen. I have a few questions that I want to put, and they don't now have to do with the legality, but have to do with international relations. We have been at the vanguard decades of trying to get international norms, and the drug conventions were part of that. We didn't want the drugs going back and forth, and so we've always been on the vanguard of international cooperation. Multilateral is very important to us, and we have resisted, even though I've suggested to the department sometimes we should put a reservation on a convention. The feedback from Global Affairs always is, no, we don't want reservations, because you see all these countries who we've brought and encouraged to come into a convention, if they start putting the exemptions, you water down the convention. And so this will be quite a shift for Canada to be saying, well, we have conventions, and we're going to do it. And you're putting the emphasis on the fact that there's national differences, okay? National circumstances should be taken into account. But if we start using that as an excuse not to fully agree with the convention, are we not inviting other people to do the same? And they can use national circumstance in any way. And as I say, Canada has led for full compliance of conventions and trying to dampen down this excuse of using national circumstances. And I can tell you conventions I've been involved with, and all the others, when we say it would be better. Article 2 of the OAS, is one. We could have put a reservation, and a very serious one, and it would have gotten us into the Inter-American, convention. And we said, no, because we don't want to put a reservation. Where has this change come, and have you contemplated what it might do dimensionally for international norms, particularly in this very fragile world where we have those people who really don't like our international norms? And we know the countries we're talking about who have done a complete shift to disregard international norms like state sovereignty, etc. So how have you taken that all into account in foreign affairs? And therefore, it's a bigger issue for me than it is just this convention. It's how Canada has approached convention and treaty making.
Thank you, and I think that's one of the key questions here, because you're quite right. Canada is committed to an international rules-based order. We're committed to the idea of norms in international affairs governing the behavior of states. What I would say, though, is you started by saying you were asking about the political side of the question, not the technical, legal aspects. And I would go back to the fact that the international community understands that not every convention is the same, and that it is an evolving system. And the member states of the drug conventions, when they meet frequently, as they did in UNGAS, they recognize that this is not, that the drug conventions should not be an inflexible set of norms, that they are evolving, and that they should evolve according to the national circumstances and priorities of countries, that the drug problem manifests itself differently around the world, and different approaches will need to be taken. So explicitly inside the political discussions of the drug control bodies, there is recognition that flexibility is required because norms evolve. It wasn't that many decades ago that women could not vote, but that norm evolved, fortunately, over time to become more progressive. And I would suggest that in terms of approach to the global drug problem, again, there will be recognition that flexibility is required and that some countries will take different approaches to respond to the overarching goal. And I would remind you here that our partners abroad believe that the number one priority is to safeguard the health and well-being of mankind. That is our goal, not strict compliance with every technical aspect of the conventions, although that is important. The overarching political goal is the health and safety, and we believe that this legislation will respond in a positive way to that overarching objective.
You've given the defense of this change in a way that I've heard from countries that might be termed fragile states, when in fact they subsidize state and non-state actors using drugs and the movement around the world. It's the same defense. How can we then approach internationally saying that what they're doing is wrong, but what we're doing is right?
Senator, I would repeat that the actions that Canada is taking are consistent with the approach that the membership of the drug conventions has established, which is that flexibility is necessary to adapt to different circumstances, as long as the goals are consistent with the overarching objective, which is health and well-being. We believe that we will be making a positive contribution. And I can assure you that our partners around the world are telling us that they want Canada not to withdraw from these conventions, but to continue to operate in them because they value the contributions we bring, and we value the international framework that exists around this multitude of substances, many of which are very dangerous and need stricter controls than others.
Okay. Did you share one of the other concerns that the international community has, one with the other, is if you're going to make changes, will you forewarn us? So were there any discussions with any international bodies or treaty officials or other states about moving this way at foreign affairs? As I still call it, global affairs. I apologize. Take me years to get over that.
Well, firstly, I can assure you, Senator, that the world has been very interested in the new policy of the current government, It was publicly announced in the campaign. It was publicly made as a commitment of so the world noticed without much help from global affairs, but I can assure you as well that we have been engaged in an ongoing conversation with our partners around the world about the new legislation, the new approach that Canada will be taking, and that conversation continues. Excuse me. In terms of the treaty bodies themselves, there's this mechanism called the International Narcotics Control Board, and they're the technical body associated with the drug framework, and they are in regular contact with us. In fact, we hosted a visit of the INCB in October 2016. They were interested in what the new approach was and how we would seek to implement it. So the conversation is ongoing at all levels, and we have been very, very open and transparent about what we're trying to do, and at the same time, our ongoing commitment to the international drug framework.
And just that, you've used the phrase health and well-being quite often, and that's what you've transmitted to our to other countries. Is there a definition that you're using of health and well-being? Or is this just a term of art that you're using and then point to the legislation?
Yeah. Senator, the term that I was referring to was the health and welfare of mankind. I should be explicit. That comes from the preamble of the Single Convention of 1961. I'm not sure there is a formal legal definition of that. I could look into it.
No, perhaps I didn't state it properly. You were saying that that's how you justify it in there. So what is the Canadian source that we are, in fact, by utilizing Bill C-45, contributing to the health and welfare of mankind? What was the justification out to the international community? That's what I'm trying to get at. We'll have our national debate on C-45, but if you have been approached by or have approached other countries and say that it is C-45 will contribute to the health and welfare of mankind by this maneuver, what definition have you used? Or do you simply say C-45 is going to contribute and you don't have to justify it further? Is that it?
No, most certainly we seek to convince our partners of the value of this new approach. And we believe that reducing the consumption by Canadian youth of cannabis is a positive contribution to the health and well-being of our population. We believe that reducing or eliminating the proceeds of the cannabis market to organized crime and to criminals is a positive contribution to the health and well-being of our country. And these are the arguments that we bring when we have conversations internationally about our new approach.
If I can catch Mr. Thompson's eye, just my final comment, and then there's a follow-up in a moment. Just a moment, please. Mr. Thompson, the question that I want to put to you, we're hearing a lot about cannabis in many forms, and its retention, both in the atmosphere, spores, etc., and within, say, a car. And so we're going to be crossing the U.S. border. Has there been any information shared that the residual, like you may not be using it today, but you may have in the past. So how are Canadians going to know how long the effect of cannabis stays with them for purposes of border crossing? It may be in their car, it may be in their clothing, it may be, etc. Because we're not quite sure yet on all the technologies around cannabis. We're just exploring it now.
Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on the science behind cannabis retention. what I can say is we will have a public education campaign to ensure that Canadians are aware of both the prohibition against moving cannabis to the U.S. border, as well as the sort of things that they can expect when they try to enter the United States. This is certainly an issue that I can take back to the people that are designing that education campaign and encourage them to address this so that when Canadians are approaching the border and there are, for instance, sniffer dogs or whatnot, that they don't find themselves in a situation where they are pulled away from primary into secondary.
Thank you. I think that would be helpful. I would hope they're working on it now, but if they haven't, I think you should alert them. I think we have just time for Senator No to follow up something, and then we can close.
Yes, I just want to follow up your questions because I would like to ask under the international law and then international convention, with the C-45 like this, does this put Canada at odds for possible UN Security Council seats?
Thank you, Senator. I cannot speak for what other countries might do in regards to this legislation. We believe that many countries will see Canada as taking a progressive step in terms of evolving the norms around cannabis use by our approach to strict regulation to keep it out of the hands of children, strict approach to ensuring that criminals and criminal networks aren't benefiting from this trade. We believe that many countries will see the very positive value in that, and that this is a progressive step that might contribute to them thinking that we would be a worthy voice around the Security Council table. But there will undoubtedly be countries that might have a different view, and that is their sovereign right. All I can say is that from Canada's perspective, we believe that this legislation is the right thing for the Canadian circumstance, given the challenges that we face. And we hope that over time, other countries will see that we will see the benefits that we derive from that.
So you think that Canada is not at odds at all?
I can't predict, Senator, what other countries might do when the time comes to vote. There will be many things, many considerations that they will have when they consider Canada versus another country. This may be one of those considerations, and this might be a positive attribute that they see in us, but they might not. I believe that this legislation isn't going forward with a view to winning a Security Council seat. This legislation is moving because of a belief that this will be beneficial to the health and well-being of Canadians.
I think we've come to the end of the questions. Thank you for endeavoring to answer all of the questions from many areas, etc. It is a very difficult topic. I think it's one that will affect more Canadians. And to me, the education is the key, because while we're engaged in this discussion with you, I wonder how many Canadians are involved with it, but I think it will impact all of us. So looking and reflecting on the international aspects is critically important to a country like Canada. We very much depend on our multilateral relationships, and so thank you for coming before us. If you can follow up on the few points that we've asked you on, and if we need more information, we'll be back to the department requesting it, and trust that you will respond. We have a very short time frame, and so we've been put under pressure, and we may have to put you under pressure. So that's a bit of a warning that our turnaround time is very, very short. So thank you for coming and responding and opening our debate and reflection on Bill C-45 as it impacts our international relations. Senators, I have two issues. One is the Venezuela response from the government has been circulated to you earlier this week. We will be looking at it from the steering and seeing whether we want to respond again to the government. So that it's there for your reading. The other thing is that we are having a meeting tomorrow, and it's in room 257 East Block. We made the trade with Legal and Constitutional because they have an overabundance of witnesses that will not fit into that room, and we do give to each other. So I just want to warn you that it is in the other building, and then I'll check how many of you showed up here, including myself. We often do that in a rush. So if you can be reminded, it's in 257. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.
Sure.